I wanted to talk about the quality of empathy and not about this year's election. We've been hearing all about this year's election, and I think some of us are a little bit weary of it, but there may be a key in empathy as a route out of serious divisions and the way people can relate to each other best. So what really is empathy, and is there room for empathy? Is there space in our hearts and in our relationships to cultivate empathy? With empathy, a person can kind of read another person's mental state, can recognize a mood, can see when someone else has a deeply felt need. With empathy, a person can realize what he is doing is hurtful and know to stop. With empathy, a person can recognize when a helping hand is appropriate, and with all that, can care about it, maybe act upon it by reaching out and helping. We understand that empathy is a key to building relationships and to overcome misunderstandings. But can we summon empathy? Can we cultivate it? And when it's needed most, can we bring it to bear? Now, I've been transfixed, really, by one urgent confrontation going on in the world and wondering where that empathy is. Where is it today when it's needed most, and what can arouse it and bring it to bear? Well, I'm going to skip over the election for now and the divisions that it illustrates. But what really has transfixed me is the outbreak of hostilities in the Middle East. We're really horrified and distressed by the vast number of Palestinian people who've been killed, injured, and displaced in this war between Israel and Hamas, and who continue to be attacked, as we are with the carnage visited upon the Israelis on October 7 of last year. Nevertheless, the war is but a single chapter in a back-and-forth conflict that seems to have no end. You have all the basic ingredients of an endless conflict. Each side feels victimized by the other. Each side feels they have wounds to avenge, and both are right. Palestinians are treated like a captive nation under constant martial law, and of course right now under bombardment. And Israelis are certain that if they chose to loosen their security grip, the Palestinians would destroy Israel and its inhabitants. So each side has an existential fear of annihilation by the other. They seem to have no emotional space to consider the other side's pain. There is little room for empathy. Well, I'm not going to try to offer a solution to this whole conflict, nor can I summarize the dispute and do anyone any justice. Instead, I want to talk about the human traits that underlie any entente between people and that enable people to live together, something that's lacking in the Middle East today. Try to imagine if there is something that could introduce a seed of peace in that troubled land. What there is in excess of is distrust. What is lacking is empathy, the basic fundamental understanding and acceptance that their adversary has feelings, pains and hurts, joys and needs, and that one should care. Now, the American Heritage Dictionary defines empathy simply as this: identification with and understanding of another person's situation, feelings, and motives. Easy to say, difficult to fulfill. Despite sharing misery each at the hands of the other, they cannot be said to be identifying with or appreciating each other's situations, feelings, and motives. That understanding, that acknowledgement, is key to any kind of compromise and settlement. What is it that can introduce mutual understanding between people such as these, who are locked in such enmity and distrust. So what we have in the midst of all the misery we see in the Middle East is an experiment, a natural experiment in behavior and emotions. Can empathy be fostered between people who are at once so hostile? If empathy is necessary for an entente to emerge, can it be developed and cultivated? Or is the best model for a peace plan that of the Korean Peninsula? Barbed wire, walls, a DMZ. Is there space for empathy at all? Well, from all that I see from this distance, the Palestinians and the Israelis, though they live in such close proximity, have little empathy for each other, little sympathy for each other's plight. A leader, ethical culture leader, Joe Schuman from the New York Society, recently traveled to Israel, and he came back to report that he never heard Israelis express sympathy for the Gazans who are being bombed to smithereens. And you will rarely hear a Palestinian quoted to say something sympathetic about Israelis. Of course, there's a lot of history to justify anger and resentment, a lot of water under the bridge. The enmity has been earned on both sides. But rather than try to suss out any theory about who's at greater fault, I just suggest we take it as a given that they harbor a little empathy for each other, that they start at a point below zero on the scale. So what does it take to see the other, really see, to have respectful insight into the other? Psychologists say that one person's recognition of the mind in another person, of mental operations, is really only a hunch. There's no proof that another person has thoughts, they say. It's not obvious on the face of things that the person next to you is an entire universe of feelings, thoughts, and ideas. We only operate on a theory of mind, an inference of mentality, when we assess another individual and attribute mental processes to them. These processes are under the skin, and they don't show. So we attribute mentality to the next person or project it on them, sometimes a lot and sometimes a little. So it's possible to not attribute thoughts and feelings at all to someone, to take them as an unfeeling ogre, to objectify the other, to demonize the other. It takes an act of empathy to make that leap and attribute feelings to the stranger. In ethical culture, we say that we strive to attribute worth to a stranger. We do that as a matter of faith, not really as a matter of judgment. So a person who is by nature empathetic and is motivated to do so can see much better that a person who is different is in fact a thinking, feeling, believing person. And not everyone is motivated to exercise their empathy. So the Middle East would require some empaths, some people who have a greater than normal capacity for empathy, to be leaders, to reach out to the other side. If only leaders could emerge and commit to this process. Well, humans aren't ants or bees, but they do live in communities, and when left to their own devices, humans will develop an organizational structure of self-management. It happens all the time. People rarely live in solitude or in chaos, and they do their best work when cooperating in teams, in villages, in countries. So humans have the capacity, they're pretty good at relating to one another when they want to. They can appreciate each other's feelings, needs, and goals because much of that is, in fact, shared. People develop an affinity for others within what they define as their community and participate in communal activities. Query, can Israelis and Palestinians possibly define a community that includes both peoples, even a small element of community? Yuval Harari, in his popular book *Sapiens*, wrote that a unique trait among all the animals is one ability that humans have. Humans invent shared illusions, like, for example, nationality, gods, monetary currency. These things have no intrinsic basis in reality, but when everyone joins in the illusion, they do become real. They're shared illusions. Money is a shared illusion. It has no intrinsic value. It only has value because we all agree that it has value. When faith in the money is lost, then people all abandon the currency and the market crashes like a punctured balloon. Nationality is an illusion, that we belong to one tribe instead of another when we could just as easily be in the other tribe. So can these warring, distrusting, mutually demonizing people, can they develop a shared illusion? Well, other than the old illusion that the other group will magically disappear one day. Constructive illusions based on a shared project, if not a shared society. In ordinary conflicts, there are workable paths to entente, even extraordinary conflicts. The Irish came to an agreement and their antagonism was intense. They had extremists who continued to foster violence and spoiled every effort at détente. After World War II, the Germans and the French came together. They built shared institutions one by one and slowly constructed a shared confederation. Today, it's hard to comprehend the degree of bitter enmity that existed between those people. It took some 40 years, more than a generation. But with the leadership of some committed leaders, they were able to make it happen. So what does it take to foster empathy? Psychologists and therapists know a lot about how to do it, and some of you here practice that as a profession. There's open communication, a sense of fully expressing oneself and all one's needs. There is follow-through, so you can be relied upon to be truthful and to be trusted. There are lists of things one can do to foster empathy and to create trust. And there are organizations that try to promote inter-community communication. They arrange groups of youth to meet in the hope that their familiarity will build a foundation of peace. Thinking of like Seeds of Peace as a group that brings young people together. And there are other organizations that try those practices. But there hasn't been far-reaching success. As far as I've been able to see, many of these organizations are mostly Israeli, and the interpersonal relationships they encourage are difficult to sustain in the hostile atmosphere. Many of the groups attract criticism for relying primarily on the personal relationships while being weak on institutional changes that would enable the building of a civil society. How can you have meaningful relationships absent basic civic justice? And how can relationships endure when the surrounding atmosphere supports hostility? And of course, there's nothing better for erasing years of effort at an entente than by having a new war. October 7 was another defining moment for most Israelis. It's hard to imagine that either population would engage in cooperation now, but it is imagination that everyone needs now most of all. There's no other way to cultivate empathy between people than by halting the war and rebuilding a system by which both Palestinians and Israelis can labor together to build new cities, learn from each other's lives. So is there any reason to hope? One thing that I see is that the frequent demonstrations in Israel are not calling for death to Palestinians. They're calling for the government to negotiate for the return of the hostages. Today's urgency is for the hostages to be returned. It's likely that if, by some chance, there were an offer by Hamas to release the hostages, both dead and alive, the war would really end. That's my belief. So whence empathy, our primary ingredient in fostering peace? The people need a truce first and foremost. No one will be a winner in the war. And only in the quietude of a truce can there be an opportunity for imagination to be exercised. There are many opportunities for cooperative effort, should there be the leadership to do it. In Ireland, a large development fund was created, offering to underwrite projects that benefited both sides. That was a concrete way to reestablish cooperation. In Europe, it was a steel manufacturing pact. Who would think? That served as the seed necessary to build cooperation and trust between Germany and France. So what might be the seed out of which cooperation can grow in the Middle East? If the leaders could just lower the hateful rhetoric, if schools would stop teaching children that their aim in life is to conquer the other side, if there could be positive encounters between youth, between educators, between other affinity groups, professional groups, if the reality is acknowledged and accepted that they are both destined to live there, a community can be stitched together serving both people in that tiny land. Now, if they could do it, then we could do it here. Thank you for listening. We have